My son kicked me out of the house I built myself. He said he needed to sell it and that I wasn't welcome there anymore. I swallowed the pain and disappeared. But when I came back, they were terrified. And to understand how I got to this moment, let me tell you how it all started. You know that feeling of peace that only comes when you look out the window and see what you built with your own 2 hands? That's exactly how Margaret Thompson felt every morning at 72 years old, living in that wooden house in Asheville, North Carolina. Her husband, who'd passed away a few years back, built every single piece of that place with love and sweat. 3 acres of forest all around, a cozy cabin that smelled like firewood and fresh coffee. It was simple, but it was hers. It was everything she had, and it was everything she needed. That elderly mother would wake up early, tend to the garden, talk to the birds like they were old friends, and live in a peaceful routine that most people only dream about having in retirement. But here's the detail that hurts just to talk about. She lived alone, not because she wanted to, but because her only son, Daniel, barely showed up anymore. You know that type of ungrateful son who forgets where he came from? Well, Daniel was exactly like that. He was too busy with his own life, with his new wife, with that lifestyle he was trying to maintain, but that was clearly above his means. Margaret didn't hold a grudge, at least she tried not to. She convinced herself that he was just busy, that one day he'd come back, that one day the family would be together again. But deep down, really deep down, that loneliness weighed heavy. The afternoons were long. Margaret would sit on the porch with a cup of tea, looking at the dirt road that led to the house, waiting. Waiting for what? Maybe a surprise visit, maybe a phone call, maybe just a sign that she still mattered to someone. The silence of the forest was beautiful, but it was also deafening when you realize nobody's going to walk down that path just to see you. She'd call Daniel from time to time, leave messages on his cell phone, send text messages that took days to get answered, when they were answered at all. And the response always came short, cold, rushed. "I'm good, Mom. We'll talk later." Have you ever felt that pain of loving someone who doesn't seem to care about you? Margaret felt it every single day. She'd look at the old photos hanging on the wall. Daniel as a child, smiling in her lap, full of life and gratitude. Where did that little boy go? Where did the son who promised to take care of her when she got old disappear to? Now, he barely remembered she existed, and Claire, the gold-digger daughter-in-law who'd entered his life, seemed to have completed the separation. Margaret never said anything, but she felt it. She felt that woman didn't like her, that she saw her mother-in-law as a burden, as something disposable. Even so, Margaret kept moving forward. She wasn't the type to give up easily. She took care of the house, kept everything tidy, as if at any moment Daniel might show up with his family, and she needed to be ready to welcome them. She cleaned the guest room every week, changed the sheets, put fresh flowers on the nightstand. It was a silly hope, she knew, but it was all she had. This real story of silent abandonment happens in so many families, but when it's with you, when it's happening to you, it hurts in a way nobody can explain. The property was modest but valuable. Margaret knew that land, that house, was worth a good amount on the market, but it never crossed her mind to sell. That wasn't just a house. It was memory, it was history. It was the legacy her husband left behind. Every floorboard, every ceiling beam, every tree planted around it, everything had meaning. She imagined that one day, maybe Daniel would understand that he'd come back, bring the grandchildren she never met, and they'd all live happy moments there. Was it a naive dream? Maybe, but it was her dream. The seasons passed and Margaret stayed there, strong. In winter, she'd light the fireplace and wrap herself in an old blanket, reading books she'd read 1,000 times before. In spring, she'd tend to the garden lovingly, planting flowers that exploded in vibrant colors. In summer, she'd sit in the shade of the trees and listen to the wind tell stories. In autumn, she'd sweep the dry leaves and prepare for the cold that was coming. Each season brought its beauty, but also its loneliness. That elderly mother lived in a routine that was both peaceful and painful, because peace without company is just silence. She didn't complain to anyone. She wasn't the type who plays the victim or puts the blame on others. Margaret had pride, had dignity. When neighbors asked about Daniel, she'd smile and say, "Oh, he's good, working hard." She never admitted the pain she felt, never let anyone see the tears that fell when she was alone. She was a strong woman, one of those who holds it together by herself and still smiles at the world. But everyone has a limit, you know, and hers was getting close, really close. And then, on just another day, everything changed. Out of nowhere, Daniel started calling. Claire sent messages, they scheduled visits, showed up with flowers, helped with groceries. Margaret felt her heart warm up. Finally they'd come back. But there's a saying that goes, when the offering is too much, the saint gets suspicious. And Margaret, deep down, should have been suspicious, because this emotional story that seemed to be taking a happy turn was about to become the worst nightmare she'd ever imagined living through. Have you ever had that feeling that something too good to be true probably isn't true? Margaret should have felt that, but she didn't. When Daniel started showing up more often, bringing Claire along, she was happy, genuinely happy. After years of being practically abandoned, seeing her son at the door with a bouquet of flowers seemed like a miracle. "Hi, Mom, we brought this for you," he'd say with that smile she remembered from his childhood. And Margaret? She'd open the door with her heart tight with emotion, invite them both in, make coffee, bake those cookies Daniel loved when he was a kid. It was like time had turned back. The visits became frequent. Every week they'd show up, always with some excuse. "We were around here and decided to drop by." Or, "We bought some things at the market and remembered you." Claire, who before barely looked at Margaret, now smiled, asked how she was doing, even helped wash the dishes. That gold-digger daughter-in-law seemed to have completely changed. Or at least that's what Margaret wanted to believe. She didn't question, didn't suspect. She just accepted that affection like it was a gift fallen from heaven. After all, what mother doesn't want her son's attention? What mother doesn't dream of having family around again? Daniel started offering to help with things around the house. "Mom, let me fix that faucet for you. I'll take a look at that fence that's falling down." He'd bring tools, spend the afternoon working, and Margaret would watch from the window with tears in her eyes. It seemed like finally, he'd become the son she always wanted him to be. That ungrateful son from the past had transformed into a responsible, caring, present man. At least that's what she believed. But the truth was hidden right underneath that veneer of kindness. Claire was especially attentive. She'd take Margaret shopping, help her pick out new clothes, even suggested they get their nails done together. "You deserve to take care of yourself, Margaret. Let's enjoy." And Margaret, that elderly mother who hadn't received affection in so long, melted. She started seeing Claire with different eyes, thinking maybe she'd judged her daughter-in-law wrong. Maybe she wasn't so bad after all. Maybe she really cared. Every gesture, every kind word, every smile, everything seemed so real. And when you're starving for affection, any crumb seems like a feast, doesn't it? The conversations during coffee got longer. Daniel talked about his work, about plans for the future, about how he wanted to spend more time with his mother. "I know I was absent, Mom, but now it's different. We're here for you." Margaret would hold his hand, squeeze it tight, and say with a choked voice, "I know, son. I knew you'd come back." And he'd smile. That smile she trusted. That smile she loved. But behind that smile, there was a plan, a cruel, calculated plan that Margaret didn't even dream existed. This emotional story was about to reveal its darkest side. They started talking about protecting Margaret. "Mom, have you thought about what'll happen to this house if something happens to you?" Daniel asked one day, with a tone of concern that seemed genuine. "There are a lot of bad people out there, opportunists who trick the elderly. We need to make sure you're safe, that your assets are protected." Margaret didn't understand much about bureaucracy, paperwork, those complicated things, but she trusted her son. If he said it was important, then it was important. "What do you think I should do?" she asked, innocent. Claire joined the conversation, reinforcing it. "There are documents that can protect the property, Margaret. It's just a precaution, you know, to make sure nobody's going to try to trick you or take what's yours." She spoke with so much conviction, with so much apparent concern, that Margaret started thinking she really needed to do something. After all, she was already an elderly woman, and the world was full of dishonest people, right? She didn't want to lose the house her husband built, the land that was her legacy. If there was a way to protect all that, why not do it? Daniel promised to take care of everything. "Leave it to me, Mom. I'll talk to a lawyer, handle all this paperwork. You don't need to worry about anything." And Margaret, relieved, accepted. She thought she finally had someone taking care of her, someone worried about her well-being. That feeling of support, of security, was so good after being alone for so long. How could she imagine she was being manipulated? How could she know that all that affection was just a trap? Trust is a beautiful thing, but it can also be dangerous when placed in the wrong hands. The weeks passed, and Margaret felt happier than she'd felt in years. The house didn't seem so empty anymore. The loneliness didn't weigh as much. She had her son back. She had a daughter-in-law who seemed to care. She had hoped that the family was finally united. But out there, behind the scenes, Daniel and Claire were finalizing the details of their plan. A plan that would destroy Margaret in a way she never imagined possible. And it would all start with a simple signature, a signature that would change her life forever. While Margaret made tea and dreamed of a happy future with her son, the reality was quite different. Daniel and Claire were drowning in debt. And when I say drowning, I mean drowning for real. The renovation business Daniel was trying to keep afloat owed over $85,000 to the bank. $85,000. Can you imagine the desperation, the overdue bills, the phone calls from creditors, the threats of lawsuits? It was a financial nightmare they'd created on their own, spending beyond what they could afford, living a lifestyle they could never really sustain. And now, with their backs against the wall, they needed a quick solution. That's when Claire had the idea. On one of those nights when they were fighting about money, she looked at her husband and said, "How much is your mother's house worth again?" Daniel blinked, confused at first, until it clicked. The property had been recently appraised at $480,000, $500,000 practically sitting there, in that quiet forest, in the hands of an elderly mother who didn't even know the real value of what she had. Claire continued with that calculating tone. "She's getting old, Daniel. At some point she'll need help, care, and when that happens, it'll be too late to protect her assets." Daniel hesitated at first. Of course he hesitated. It was his mother, after all. But Claire knew exactly how to manipulate the situation. "It's not like we're taking anything from her," she argued, softening her tone. "It's just making sure that when she can't take care of herself anymore, we're in control. It's to protect her too, you understand? And as a bonus, we solve our problems." She made it seem so reasonable, so logical, so right, like they were doing Margaret a favor. That gold-digger daughter-in-law had an impressive ability to distort reality, to transform greed into concern. Little by little, Daniel gave in. The financial pressure was too much. The creditors wouldn't stop calling, and the possibility of losing everything they'd built together, as much as it was based on debt, terrified him. "But how do we do this?" he asked one early morning, while they were calculating how much time they had before the bank took their house. Claire had already done her research. She'd talked to a friend who knew about these things, had informed herself about powers of attorney, property transfers, documents that could go unnoticed by a 72-year-old lady who trusted her son. The plan formed little by little. They'd start slow, gaining Margaret's trust, hence the frequent visits, the gifts, the sudden attention. They'd make her believe they were there out of love, out of genuine concern. Then they'd introduce the idea of protecting the property, using the fear of scammers and opportunists as justification. And finally, they'd bring the documents. Documents that Margaret would sign without suspecting because she trusted them, because they were family, because deep down, she just wanted to believe her son had come back to stay. This real story of family manipulation happens more than we think, but we never think it'll happen to us. Claire was the mastermind behind everything. Daniel was weak, easily influenced, especially when he was desperate. She knew that and used it to her advantage. Think about it, Daniel. We're not stealing from anyone. When she dies, the house would be yours anyway, right? We're just speeding things up, And with the money we save our business, our life, our future. She painted a picture where they were victims of bad circumstances, and Margaret was just an inconvenient obstacle between them and the solution to their problems. Such coldness, such lack of empathy. But when greed takes over, conscience goes away. They rehearsed the lines. Claire taught Daniel exactly what to say, how to seem concerned, how to sound genuine. Remember, you have to make it seem like you're doing this for her. You can't let it show that we need this money. It has to be all about protecting Margaret. And Daniel practiced in front of the mirror until the words came out naturally. It was sad to see how far an ungrateful son could go when pressed by circumstances and influenced by the wrong person. He knew what they were planning was wrong, but necessity, or rather desperation, spoke louder. Meanwhile, Margaret lived in her own world, happy to have her family back. She had no idea that every visit, every smile, every hug was part of a carefully architected plan to take from her everything she had. She didn't see the whispered conversations between Daniel and Claire when they thought she wasn't listening. Didn't notice Claire's calculating looks as she observed the property, already imagining how much all that would be worth when they put it up for sale. Margaret was blind with love, with longing, with hope, and those three things together can be dangerous. The day was approaching. Daniel had the documents ready, hidden in a folder inside the car. He and Claire had agreed. They'd make the visit seem casual, as always, and then, in a quiet moment, Daniel would bring up the subject. "Mom, remember we talked about protecting your assets? I brought the papers for you to sign. It's just a formality." Simple as that. And Margaret, trusting, would sign. She'd sign without reading properly, without questioning, because she trusted them, because they were family. And that signature would change everything, forever. It was a Tuesday afternoon, one of those calm and unhurried ones, when Daniel showed up alone at Margaret's house. He'd called ahead, letting her know he'd stop by, and she got excited. She always did when her son showed his face. She made fresh coffee, put his favorite cookies on a pretty platter, and waited on the porch. When his car appeared on the dirt road, kicking up that fine dust that sparkled in the afternoon sun, her heart filled with that silly mother's joy. He got out of the car with a black folder under his arm, and that smile she knew so well. "Hi, Mom," he said, giving a quick hug. Margaret didn't even notice the hug was shorter than usual. They sat on the porch, like they always did. Daniel drank the coffee, praised the cookies, asked how she was feeling. Everything seemed normal, natural, like it had been in recent weeks. But there was something different in the air, a tension that Margaret couldn't identify, but that was there, hovering between them. Daniel stirred the coffee cup harder than necessary, avoided looking directly into her eyes for too long. He was nervous, but disguised it well. After a few minutes of small talk about the weather and neighbors, he finally pulled out the folder. "Mom, remember that conversation about protecting the property?" Margaret nodded, still smiling. "Of course, son. You said you were going to handle that for me." She trusted so much, so very much, that she didn't question anything when he opened the folder and took out a bunch of papers. "I brought the documents," he said, trying to seem casual. "It's just to make sure nobody's going to be able to take this house from you. With so many stories of scams out there, of people tricking the elderly, we need to be careful, you know?" He spoke fast, like he wanted to get through it as quickly as possible. Margaret took the papers, looked them over, but the letters seemed to dance in front of her eyes. There were so many legal terms, so many complicated words. "Where do I sign, son?" she asked, already grabbing the pen he was extending. Daniel pointed to the spots marked with small yellow stickers. "Here, here, and here. Just your signature, nothing major." He tried to sound calm, but his heart was beating so hard he was sure his mother could hear it. Margaret signed. Once, twice, 3 times. Her shaky handwriting, like an elderly person's, was getting imprinted on those documents she'd barely read. She trusted her son. Why would she read carefully something he said was to protect her? That elderly mother had no idea she'd just signed the complete transfer of the property into Daniel's name. Had no idea that at that moment she was losing everything. Daniel collected the papers quickly with an almost abrupt movement and put everything back in the folder. "Done, Mom. Now you're protected." He forced a smile, but couldn't hide the relief mixed with guilt taking over him. Margaret, innocent, smiled back. "Thank you, son. I feel calmer knowing you're taking care of this for me." She held his hand, squeezed it lovingly, and Daniel felt a lump in his throat. For 1 second, just 1 second, he almost gave up on everything, almost took the papers back and tore them all up right there. But he thought about the debts, about Claire, about the bank's threats, and the moment passed. He didn't stay long after that, made up some excuse about having to get back to work, gave a quick kiss on his mother's forehead, and left. Margaret stayed on the porch, waving while his car disappeared down the road. She felt good, even happy, thought she'd done something important, something that would protect her husband's legacy. Little did she know she'd just lost everything. This emotional story was taking a tragic turn, but Margaret didn't know yet. Still lived in the illusion that she was safe, that her son was taking care of her. The truce would only come a few days later. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Margaret went to get the mail, like she did every day, and found an official envelope with the registry office seal. She opened it, curious, and started reading. At first she didn't really understand. They were legal terms, information about change in property ownership. She read again, slowly, trying to process. And then, like a punch to the stomach, she understood. The house wasn't hers anymore. The land wasn't hers anymore. Everything had been transferred into Daniel's name. She held the letter with trembling hands, felt her legs weaken, and had to lean on the table to keep from falling. "No, it can't be," she murmured to herself, rereading the letter a third, fourth time, hoping she'd understood wrong. But she hadn't. The words were there, black and white, destroying her world. Margaret felt a pain in her chest so strong she thought she'd have a heart attack right there. It wasn't just the material loss. It was the betrayal. The betrayal of an ungrateful son she loved more than anything, that she'd raised, cared for, protected her entire life. How could he do this? How did he have the nerve? The tears came, hot and silent, running down her face as she held that cursed letter. She called Daniel, called 3, 4, 5 times. He didn't answer. Sent desperate messages. "Son, I need to talk to you urgently. Please, call me." Nothing. He was avoiding her, she knew. Finally, after hours, he responded with a cold message. "Mom, don't worry. It's all part of the protection process. We'll talk later." Protection? What kind of protection was it that took from her the only asset she had? Margaret sat on the kitchen floor, hugged her knees, and cried like she hadn't cried in years. The world had collapsed. And the worst part, the worst, is that it had been her own son who knocked everything down, and she didn't even see it coming. The following days were the longest of Margaret's life. She could barely sleep, could barely eat. She'd sit in the living room, looking at the walls her husband had built, at the furniture they'd bought together over the years, at the photos hanging that told the story of her life. All of that wasn't hers anymore. Legally, officially, none of that belonged to her anymore. And the pain of that realization was suffocating. She tried talking to Daniel several times, but he always made up excuses not to show up. Claire didn't respond to messages. It was like they wanted her to disappear, to accept everything in silence. But how do you accept a betrayal like that? How do you swallow that kind of total humiliation? 2 months went by. 2 months of Margaret living in a kind of limbo, not knowing what to do, where to go, how to react. She consulted a local lawyer, but he was straightforward. "Mrs. Thompson, the transfer was done legally. You signed the documents. Reversing this is going to be difficult, expensive, and there's no guarantee of success." Difficult, expensive, no guarantees. The words echoed in her head. She didn't have money for a legal battle, didn't have the strength to face her own son in court. So she waited, prayed, believed that maybe Daniel would come to his senses, that he'd realize what he'd done and fix everything. But reason never came. It was on a Saturday morning that they showed up, Daniel and Claire, together, with those serious faces of people about to deliver bad news. Margaret opened the door, her heart tight, already knowing it wouldn't be anything good. "Mom, we need to talk," Daniel said, entering without waiting for an invitation. They sat in the living room, that same living room where Margaret had rocked Daniel when he was a baby, where she'd taken care of him when he got sick, where she'd celebrated each of his birthdays. And now, there, in that place full of memories. They were going to destroy what was left of her world. Claire got straight to the point, without beating around the bush. Margaret, we've decided to renovate the whole house. It's going to be a big project. Margaret blinked, confused. Renovate? But why? The house is fine. Claire sighed, impatient. It's not fine, Margaret. It's old, needs improvements. And for that, you're going to need to leave for a while. Leave? Margaret felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Leave to where? Daniel, who until then had stayed silent, finally spoke, but without looking in her eyes. We renovated the garage. You can stay there temporarily. It's small, but it's comfortable. The garage. They wanted that elderly mother to go live in the garage of her own house while they renovated everything. The humiliation was so much that Margaret couldn't even respond right away. But the worst was still to come. In the following weeks, it became clear that the renovation was just an excuse. Daniel and Claire started bringing realtors to see the property. Margaret watched from the garage window. Yes, she'd accepted staying there because she had nowhere else to go, while strangers walked through the house, evaluated the land, took notes. They were going to sell. They were going to sell the house her husband built, the place where she'd spent the best years of her life, and she couldn't do anything. Just watch while her world was dismantled piece by piece. This real story of greed and family betrayal left scars that would never heal. One afternoon, Claire showed up at the garage, knocked on the door with that arrogant attitude of someone who thinks they own everything, because technically, now she did. Margaret opened the door, and what came next was the last straw. Margaret, we need you to leave permanently. The house is going to be sold, and you can't be here when the buyers come for the final inspection. She said this coldly, like she was asking Margaret to take out the trash, not asking her to abandon her own home. Margaret felt tears burn in her eyes. But where will I go? Claire shrugged. I don't know. But you need to leave. We need that money. We need that money. Those words kept echoing in Margaret's head. They needed the money so badly they were willing to leave an elderly mother on the street, an ungrateful son who felt no remorse, a gold-digger daughter-in-law who only saw dollars where she should see humanity. Margaret looked at Claire, and for the first time, didn't try to be polite, didn't try to maintain composure. You're gonna regret this, she said, her voice trembling with anger and pain. One day, you're gonna regret it. Claire laughed, a short, unpleasant laugh. Sure, Margaret, whatever you want to believe. And she left, slamming the door behind her. Margaret had a week to leave, 1 week to gather the things of a lifetime, to find a place to live, to start from scratch at 72 years old. She had no family besides Daniel, didn't have much money saved, just enough to survive a few months. Friends were few. Most had already died or moved away. She was alone, completely alone. She spent those days packing memories, crying over each object that had meaning, trying to decide what to take and what to leave behind. It was like planning her own funeral, except she was still alive to feel every second of that pain. On the last day, Margaret took one final walk through the house. She ran her hand along the walls, looked out the bedroom window where she'd slept with her husband for so many years, sat on the porch where she'd had coffee every morning. The tears wouldn't stop falling, but she made no noise. She cried in silence, like she'd learned to do throughout that whole ordeal. Daniel didn't even show up to say goodbye. Claire sent a messenger to pick up the keys, and just like that, without ceremony, without a final hug, without an apology, Margaret was kicked out of her own house. She put the suitcases in her old car, took one last look back, and drove away, not knowing yet that this emotional story was far from over. Margaret drove for hours without a certain destination, tears blurring her vision, her heart heavy as lead. She didn't know where to go, hadn't planned anything beyond leaving that house before the humiliation got even worse. That's when she saw the sign on the side of the road. Pinewood Trailer Park, vacancies available. She slowed down, looked at the place through the trees, and something inside her said this was it. It wasn't ideal, far from it, but it was what she could afford. She entered slowly through the rusty metal gate, past trailers of all kinds, some well-maintained, others falling apart, until she found the office. A man about 60 years old with a graying beard and gentle smile helped her. Looking for a place to stay? She nodded, her voice failing when she tried to explain. He didn't ask much, just showed what was available. It was a 1979 trailer, small with moisture stains on the walls and a musty smell that made her eyes burn. But it cost $360 a month for the lot rental, and it was all Margaret could afford now. "I'll take it," she said, signing the contract with trembling hands. The man handed over the keys and gave her a pat on the shoulder. "Welcome to Pinewood, ma'am. We take care of each other here." Margaret didn't know yet, but those words would prove true in a way she never imagined. That elderly mother had just found an unexpected refuge. The first days were the hardest. Margaret cleaned the trailer from floor to ceiling, trying to transform that cramped space into something that felt like a home. She threw away what was ruined, arranged the furniture as best she could, hung some photos she'd brought. But at night, when silence came, reality hit hard. She was living in an old trailer alone at 72 years old, while her son and gold-digger daughter-in-law had probably already sold the house and were spending her money. The anger mixed with sadness was almost unbearable. She'd cry herself to sleep, wake up with swollen eyes, and face another day trying to understand how life had gotten to this point. But the trailer park had something special: the people. Margaret started meeting the neighbors and realized each of them had a difficult story too. There was Donna, a 65-year-old black woman who'd lost her house in a hurricane and never managed to recover financially. There was Joe, a war veteran who struggled with PTSD and lived on a minimal pension. There was Rosa, a Mexican immigrant who worked 3 jobs to support her grandchildren after her daughter had died. Nobody there was living the American dream, but everyone took care of each other. And little by little, Margaret started feeling part of that unlikely community. This real story of late-in-life new beginnings had its moments of light in the middle of darkness. Margaret started cooking for the neighbors. She'd always been good in the kitchen and had plenty of time now. She'd make those huge stews, apple pies that smelled like cinnamon and care, homemade breads that came out warm from the trailer's little oven, and she'd distribute them. "I made too much. I won't be able to eat it all by myself," she'd say. But everyone knew it was an excuse. She cooked because she needed to feel useful, because she needed to give something of herself, because generosity was the only thing Daniel and Claire hadn't managed to steal from her. And the neighbors reciprocated however they could. Joe fixed things in the trailer. Donna brought clothes she didn't wear anymore. Rosa taught Spanish on Sunday afternoons. The weeks turned into months, and Margaret became a beloved figure at Pinewood. The children in the park called her Grandma Maggie, even though she wasn't related to any of them. She helped with homework, told stories, gave advice to whoever needed it. On Friday nights, people would gather in a common area, bring chairs, food, a guitar, and stay there talking until late. Margaret participated in everything, and little by little, that sharp pain in her chest transformed into something different. It hadn't healed completely, it never would, but it had become bearable. She'd found a family where she least expected it. But this elderly mother's story still had twists ahead. Despite everything, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about justice. At night, lying on the thin trailer mattress, she'd imagined Daniel and Claire spending the money from selling the house, living well while she survived on the bare minimum. The anger came back, boiling inside her. She'd been naive, had trusted blindly, but that didn't give them the right to do what they did. The lawyer she'd consulted before said it was difficult, but not impossible. Maybe there was a way to fight. Maybe it still wasn't too late. But she didn't have money to hire anyone, didn't have resources to face a legal battle. So she kept that desire for justice deep in her heart, waiting for something. It was on a Saturday morning that everything started to change. Margaret was watering the flowers she'd planted in little pots in front of the trailer when she saw a moving truck parking 3 lots ahead. A man about 60 years old, neatly cut gray hair, thin framed glasses, started unloading boxes with the help of 2 young men. He had that air of someone who'd had a comfortable life, but had taken a few steps back. Margaret, always polite, waved. He waved back, smiling. "New neighbor," he shouted. "Not so new," she replied, and both laughed. She didn't know yet, but that casual meeting would change everything. Absolutely everything. In the following days, Margaret and the new neighbor crossed paths a few times. He introduced himself as Ethan Rivera, a retired lawyer who decided to simplify his life after a complicated divorce. "Sometimes less is more, you know," he said, drinking the coffee Margaret offered one afternoon. They talked about life, about the park, about how they'd gotten there. And then, without planning, Margaret told her story. She told about the ungrateful son, about the gold-digger daughter-in-law, about the lost house, about the signature she'd given trusting she was protecting her assets. Ethan listened to everything in silence, and the more he heard, the more his expression changed, from curiosity to surprise, from surprise to indignation. When Margaret finished, he had his fists clenched. "Margaret," he said, his voice firm, "that wasn't just wrong. That was a crime." Margaret blinked, confused. "A crime? But I signed the papers, Ethan. It was my choice." Ethan shook his head, taking off his glasses to clean them while organizing his thoughts. "No, Margaret, it wasn't your choice. You were manipulated, deceived, emotionally coerced into signing something without fully understanding the consequences. And more importantly, you were a victim of financial elder abuse." He spoke with that authority of someone who knows the law by heart, of someone who'd spent decades defending cases like this. Margaret felt a chill down her spine, not of fear, but of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Was it possible? Was it really possible to reverse all that and get justice? Ethan asked to see the documents. Margaret went to get the folder where she kept everything. The papers she'd signed, the letter from the registry office, the messages exchanged with Daniel, everything. She'd kept it all, even without knowing exactly why. Maybe deep down, she already knew that one day she'd need it. Ethan spent more than an hour analyzing each page, making notes on a yellow notepad, letting out sighs and head shakes. The more he read, the more his indignation grew. "Margaret, this here is a classic case of estate fraud. Look at this." He pointed to a clause hidden in the middle of the document written in tiny letters. "It says here that you completely transfer the property. It's not protection, it's total transfer. They tricked you." Margaret felt the tears come back, but this time they weren't just from sadness. They were from anger too. "So I can do something." Ethan looked into her eyes, and for the first time since everything had happened, Margaret saw someone who really believed she'd been wronged. "You not only can, you should. Margaret, what they did to you is a crime at the state and federal level. Financial abuse of the elderly is taken very seriously in North Carolina. We can fight, and if you're up for it, I'm going to help you." He said this with so much conviction that Margaret felt something awaken inside her. That woman who'd been crushed, humiliated, kicked out of her own house was starting to recover her strength. This emotional story was about to take a turn nobody expected. But Ethan was honest about the challenges. "It's not going to be easy, Margaret. It's going to be a long battle. It's going to hurt. And it's going to expose you and your family in a way that might be uncomfortable. Daniel's going to have to be confronted publicly. There'll be hearings, witnesses. It'll be exhausting. You need to be prepared for that." Margaret didn't hesitate for even a second. "I'm prepared. They took everything from me, Ethan. Everything. I don't have anything left to lose." And in that moment, she was no longer the fragile, confused, elderly mother. She was a woman determined to recover her dignity, her home, her life. And Ethan, seeing that gleam in her eyes, smiled. "Then let's go to war." The preparations began immediately. Ethan, even though retired, still had contacts in the legal world. He called some colleagues, explained the case, and managed to put together a strategy. First, they needed to gather all possible evidence: the fraudulent documents, Daniel and Claire's messages, witnesses who could confirm Margaret's mental state at the time of the signature, property appraisal, everything. Second, they needed to file a formal complaint, not just in civil court, but also with the authorities that dealt with crimes against the elderly. "We're going to attack from all sides," Ethan explained. "Civil to recover the property, criminal to hold them accountable for what they did. They won't know what hit them." Margaret told everything to the trailer park neighbors, and the reaction was immediate and touching. Donna, Joe, Rosa, and so many others offered to help. "We're your family now, Maggie," Donna said, holding her hands. And family doesn't leave anyone behind. Joe, who had some savings put away, offered money. Rosa offered to be a witness since she'd seen Margaret in the first days at the trailer, completely emotionally destroyed. And then someone had an idea. Set up a GoFundMe to help with the process costs. People need to know this story, said a younger neighbor, Sarah, who worked with social media. This can help not just you, but other people going through the same thing. The campaign was launched on a Tuesday night. Sarah wrote an emotional text telling Margaret's story, how that elderly mother had been betrayed by her ungrateful son and gold-digger daughter-in-law, how she'd lost everything, how she was now fighting to recover her dignity. They put up photos of Margaret in the trailer, old photos of the house she'd lost, copies of the fraudulent documents, with sensitive information covered. The title was simple but powerful. Help Margaret fight for justice against family abuse. The initial goal was $5,000 to cover the initial process costs. Nobody expected what happened next. The story went viral. Within 24 hours, they'd already raised $3,000. Within a week, they'd surpassed $12,000. The support messages came in droves. People from all over the country sharing their own stories of family abuse, of elderly people being taken advantage of by greedy relatives, of similar betrayals. My mother went through the same thing, wrote a woman from Ohio. Stay strong, Margaret. You're gonna win. A man from Texas sent $100 and a message. My father was tricked by his own children. He died before getting justice. Do it for yourself, but also do it for all of us who didn't have that chance. Margaret read each message with tears in her eyes, but now they were tears of gratitude. She wasn't alone. She'd never be alone again. This real story was touching hearts and awakening consciences all over the country. Meanwhile, Daniel and Claire had no idea what was coming. They'd sold the house, paid off the debts, and were living comfortably with what was left. They probably thought Margaret had accepted everything in silence, that she'd simply disappeared. What a mistake, because Margaret, with Ethan by her side and an entire community supporting her, was about to show that total humiliation can transform into absolute strength. The lawsuit was filed at the Buncombe County Courthouse on a Thursday morning, and when Daniel received the court summons at home 3 days later, he must have felt the world collapse. The war had begun, and this time, Margaret wasn't going to lose. When Daniel opened the envelope and saw the court summons, he went pale. Claire was beside him, and when he showed her the documents, the confident expression she always carried disappeared. She can't do this, Claire murmured, but her voice trembled. She signed everything. It was all legal. Daniel shook his head, reading the accusations: psychological manipulation, estate fraud, financial abuse of an elderly person, crimes that could result not just in restitution, but in criminal proceedings too. They'd underestimated Margaret. They thought that elderly mother would simply accept defeat and disappear. But no, she was fighting, and apparently she had help. The lawyer's name on the lawsuit was Ethan Rivera, and a quick Google search showed he'd been one of the best real estate lawyers in the region before retiring. The first hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Ethan used that time to build a case solid as rock. He gathered witnesses from the trailer park who could attest to Margaret's emotional state when she arrived, destroyed, confused, clearly traumatized. He got copies of the messages Daniel and Claire had sent, including that cold message Daniel sent when Margaret discovered the transfer. It's all part of the protection process. Ethan also brought in a document expert who analyzed the papers and confirmed that the language used was purposely confusing, made to deceive someone without legal knowledge. And most importantly, he got the bank records that showed Daniel and Claire's massive debts at the time of the transfer. $85,000 owed to the bank. The motive was clear. It wasn't protection. It was pure greed. The trailer park community mobilized in an impressive way. On the day of the first hearing, more than 20 people from Pinewood showed up at the courthouse to support Margaret. Donna, Joe, Rosa, Sarah, and so many others filled the gallery seats, some holding discreet signs. Justice for Margaret. The elderly deserve respect. Margaret entered the courtroom hand in hand with Ethan, and when she saw all those familiar faces there for her, she almost broke down, but she held it together. She needed to be strong. needed to show the judge, the jury, the world, that she wasn't a confused, incapable old lady. She was a woman who'd been deceived, yes, but who was now fighting with all the strength she had. This emotional story was reaching its most critical moment. On the other side of the room, Daniel and Claire were visibly uncomfortable. They'd hired a lawyer too, but the guy didn't seem very confident. How do you defend the indefensible? How do you justify taking the house from an elderly mother, kicking her out of her own property, and on top of that, selling everything to pay off personal debts? Their lawyer tried to argue that the transfer had been legitimate, that Margaret had signed of her own free will, that there was no proof of coercion. But Ethan destroyed each argument with surgical precision. He showed the messages, showed the debts, showed the perfect timing. Daniel and Claire only started worrying about Margaret exactly when they were drowning financially. Coincidence? Of course not. The witnesses started testifying. First was Rosa, who told how she found Margaret on her first day at the trailer park, crying, lost, not knowing what to do with her life. She told me her son had stolen everything from her. Rosa testified, her voice firm. She didn't understand how that had happened. She trusted him. Then it was Joe, who explained how Margaret had arrived at Pinewood with practically nothing, just a few suitcases and a broken heart. She wasn't a confused or senile woman, Joe said, looking directly at the judge. She was a woman who'd been betrayed by her own family. There's a huge difference in that. Each testimony hammered the same point. Margaret had been a victim, not an accomplice. Then it was Margaret's turn to testify. Ethan prepared her for this moment, but even so, getting up in that witness chair was one of the hardest things she'd ever done. Daniel's lawyer tried to discredit her, suggesting she was forgetful, that maybe she hadn't read the documents carefully because she didn't have the capacity to understand. But Margaret responded with a clarity that silenced the entire room. "I didn't read it because I trusted my son," she said, her voice trembling but firm. When your own son says he's protecting you, you believe him. You don't imagine he's planning to take everything from you and throw you on the street. Was I naive? I was. But that doesn't make what they did any less criminal. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel also had to testify, and it was painful to watch. He avoided looking at Margaret, kept fidgeting with his hands. His voice failed when he tried to explain the decisions he'd made. I thought I was doing the right thing," he murmured. "The debts were killing us, and my mother's house, she didn't need that much space." Ethan interrupted. "Mr. Thompson, did you ask your mother if she wanted to sell the house?" Daniel fell silent. "No." "Did you clearly explain what she was signing?" Silence again. "Not exactly." "Did you give her other options besides signing the documents?" Daniel lowered his head. "No." Each no was another nail in the coffin of their defense. That ungrateful son was being exposed in front of everyone. And then came the moment nobody expected. During her own testimony, Claire completely lost her patience. Margaret's lawyer was questioning why she'd insisted so much on the property transfer, why she'd pressured Daniel to act quickly. Claire, who until then had been trying to maintain composure, exploded. "Because she didn't need that house," she shouted, standing up from her chair. "An old woman alone on a huge piece of land? It's a waste. We needed it more. We had a whole life ahead of us, debts to pay, dreams to fulfill. She already lived her life." The entire room was shocked. The judge banged his gavel, asking for order, but the damage was done. That gold digger daughter-in-law had just confessed everything in front of everyone. Margaret looked at her and, despite the pain, felt something like relief. Finally, the truth had come out, and there was no going back. The judge, a man about 60 years old named Harold Mitchell, known for being fair but severe, looked at Claire with an expression that mixed disbelief and indignation. He adjusted his glasses, banged the gavel one more time to ensure order was maintained, and said, with a voice that cut through the silence of the room, "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. That sentence is enough." Claire realized the mistake she'd made, tried to backtrack, started stuttering explanations, but her lawyer pulled her arm, telling her to sit down and be quiet. But it was too late. Those words, "She didn't need that house. We needed it more," echoed in the room like a complete confession. The judge made notes on his pad, and anyone who knew the law knew The case had just turned completely in Margaret's favor. Ethan didn't even need to do much more. He just looked at the judge and said, "Your Honor, I believe the defendant herself just clarified the motivations behind this fraudulent property transfer." Daniel's lawyer tried to argue that Claire was emotionally shaken, that she didn't mean it that way, but Judge Mitchell raised his hand, cutting off the speech. "Counselor, I heard what I heard, and the court recorded every word. Let's proceed." From there on, every witness Daniel's lawyer tried to call only made their situation worse. They tried to bring an old neighbor of Margaret's who would say she was forgetful, but the man ended up confirming she'd always been lucid and independent. They tried to question her mental capacity, but recent medical exams showed a woman in perfect cognitive health. The following weeks were an emotional roller coaster. Hearings, more testimonies, document analysis, expert evaluations. Margaret attended all of them, always accompanied by Ethan and some trailer park neighbors. She'd see Daniel and Claire on the other side of the room, and every day they looked smaller, more defeated. Daniel avoided her gaze, but Margaret didn't look away. She wanted him to see, wanted him to understand the pain he'd caused, the total humiliation he'd put his own mother through. It wasn't about money or property anymore. It was about dignity, about justice, about proving that elderly mother wasn't disposable, that she mattered, that she had value, and that nobody, not even her own son, had the right to take that from her. Finally, the sentencing day arrived. The courtroom was packed. The story had gained so much attention that even local journalists showed up to cover it. Margaret entered with her head held high, wearing a simple but dignified dress that Donna had helped her choose. She sat next to Ethan, took a deep breath, and waited. Judge Mitchell entered, everyone stood up, and when he sat down and grabbed the documents, the silence was so deep you could hear the tick-tock of the clock on the wall. He began to speak, reviewing the case, the arguments from both sides, the evidence presented. Margaret held Ethan's hand, her heart beating so hard it felt like it would jump out of her chest. And then, the judge spoke the words that would change everything. After careful analysis of all the evidence and testimony presented, Judge Mitchell began, his voice echoing through the room. "This court concludes that there was, in fact, psychological manipulation, estate fraud, and financial abuse of an elderly person. The property transfer was obtained through deception, without the full knowledge and informed consent of Mrs. Margaret Thompson." He paused, looked directly at Daniel and Claire, and continued. "The defendant's behavior demonstrates greed, lack of character, and profound disrespect for family ties and human dignity. Therefore, I order the following." Margaret could barely breathe. Every second seemed like an eternity. This emotional story was about to have its moment of justice. "First," the judge continued, "the property located in Asheville, North Carolina, including all 3 acres of land and structures, will be returned in full and immediately to Mrs. Margaret Thompson, with the previous transfer declared null and without legal effect." Margaret felt tears roll down her face. The house. She was getting the house back. The judge wasn't finished. "Second, the defendants Daniel Thompson and Claire Thompson are found guilty of financial abuse of an elderly person and estate fraud, being fined $55,000 to be paid to the victim as compensation for material and emotional damages cost." The room exploded in whispers, but the judge banged his gavel, asking for silence. "Third," he said, and now his voice was even more serious, "I will be forwarding this case to the appropriate authorities for additional criminal investigation, as the crimes committed here may result in consequences beyond this civil sphere." Daniel dropped his head into his hands. Claire was pale as a ghost. They hadn't just lost the case. They could face criminal charges. The judge concluded, "This court does not tolerate abuse of the elderly, especially when perpetrated by family members who should protect and honor their loved ones. May this sentence serve as an example." Case closed. The final bang of the gavel sealed everything. Justice had been done. Finally, that ungrateful son and that gold-digger daughter-in-law had been held accountable. Margaret broke down in tears, but now they were tears of relief, of victory, of gratitude. Ethan hugged her, and soon after, Donna, Joe, Rosa, and everyone else from the trailer park surrounded her, forming a circle of support and love around her. "You did it, Maggie. Donna whispered in her ear. "You did it!" Margaret looked back to the side where Daniel and Claire were being advised by their lawyer, and for the first time, she didn't feel anger. She felt pity. Pity for how they'd let greed destroy everything. Pity for how an ungrateful son had traded his mother's love for money. But she wasn't going to let that consume her. She'd won. She'd recovered her dignity, and that was all that mattered now. The news spread quickly. The GoFundMe campaign, which had already raised $12,000, exploded with more donations and support messages. People wanted to celebrate Margaret's victory, wanted to be part of this real story of overcoming. Ethan took care of all the legal procedures for transferring the property back into her name. And 3 weeks later, on a sunny spring morning, Margaret drove down the dirt road that led to her house. Yes, her house again. And when she saw that wooden structure surrounded by 3 acres of forest, she stopped the car and cried. But this time, they were tears of pure happiness. She'd come back, she'd won, and her story was far from over. Margaret opened the house door with trembling hands, and the smell that greeted her was of abandonment and dust. Daniel and Claire hadn't managed to sell before the lawsuit was filed. The property had been legally frozen as soon as Ethan entered the action. So there everything was, exactly as she'd left it months ago. The furniture covered with white sheets, the curtains closed, the heavy silence of a place that had been forgotten. But Margaret didn't let herself be discouraged. She walked through the living room, touching each surface, remembering each memory those walls held. And then, with a determination she didn't even know she still had, she started planning. That elderly mother who'd been humiliated and kicked out was now going to transform that place into a home again, into a sanctuary, into a symbol of new beginnings. The Pinewood neighbors didn't let her do anything alone. The following weekend, Joe showed up with tools. Donna brought cleaning supplies. Rosa arrived with meal containers to feed everyone. And Sarah organized a real effort. More than 15 people from the trailer park came to help renovate Margaret's house. They cleaned, fixed, painted, organized. Each room was treated with care, as if it were each one of their houses too. "You're not alone in this, Maggie," Joe said while fixing the fence that was falling down. "We're family now, and family supports each other." Margaret looked around, seeing all those people working for her, and realized she'd gained much more than the house back. She'd gained a true family, one that chose to be there, not out of obligation or blood, but out of genuine love. With part of the $55,000 compensation that Daniel and Claire were forced to pay, Margaret made some necessary improvements. She replaced the leaking roof, renovated the kitchen, installed new windows that let sunlight come in and illuminate every corner. She didn't spend it all. She saved a good part for emergencies and to live comfortably without financial worries for the next few years. But the most important thing wasn't the money. It was the meaning. Each new floorboard, each painted wall, each improvement made was a declaration. She had survived, had fought, had won. This emotional story of betrayal had transformed into a story of overcoming that inspired everyone around her. The weeks went by, and Margaret settled back into that life she thought she'd lost forever. She'd wake up early, make coffee in the renovated kitchen, sit on the porch, and look at the forest her husband loved so much. But now, the loneliness didn't weigh anymore. The Pinewood neighbors kept visiting. Some even moved to nearby houses, creating a small community around her. The afternoons were filled with conversations, laughter, shared dinners. Margaret went back to cooking for others, but now she had a spacious and cozy kitchen to do it in. Life had come full circle, and in a way she never would have imagined. That elderly mother was no longer the broken woman who'd cried in the trailer. She was strong, renewed, whole. As for Daniel and Claire, well, the news wasn't good for them. The criminal investigation Judge Mitchell had ordered resulted in formal charges. They faced additional fines, community service, and both their reputations were completely destroyed. Daniel's renovation business went bankrupt. After all, who would hire someone known for defrauding their own mother? Claire lost her job when the story spread. They had to sell their house to pay the debts and compensations. And the most ironic part? They ended up in an even worse financial situation than they were before they stole from Margaret. Greed hadn't just destroyed the family, it had destroyed themselves. This real story became a warning about the consequences of selfish choices. Margaret, being questioned by journalists and curious people about how she felt regarding her son, always gave the same answer. She'd look directly at whoever asked, with that quiet dignity she'd conquered through pain, and say, "Sometimes the best answer is silence." She didn't seek revenge beyond the justice she'd already achieved, didn't want to humiliate Daniel publicly or rub the defeat in Claire's face. She simply lived her life, rebuilt and full, without giving them the power to continue occupying her thoughts. Her silence was more powerful than any words of anger could be. It was the most dignified revenge that existed. Living well despite everything they tried to do to her. Daniel tried to get in touch a few times, called, sent messages, even showed up at the property once. Margaret saw him through the window, walking to the door with slumped shoulders, a defeated appearance. She could have opened the door, could have yelled, cursed, vented all the pain he'd caused, but she didn't do any of that. She simply stayed there watching until he gave up and left. There was nothing more to be said. That ungrateful son had made his choices and now lived with the consequences. Margaret had learned that not every relationship deserves to be saved, that sometimes peace comes from letting go, not from trying to fix what was broken beyond repair. And she was at peace. Finally, genuinely at peace. Ethan became one of Margaret's best friends. He still lived in the trailer park. He'd discovered he liked that simple life and the welcoming community. But he spent many afternoons at Margaret's house, drinking tea, talking about life, playing chess on the porch. "You saved my life, Ethan," Margaret said on one of those afternoons. He shook his head. "No, Margaret, you saved your own life. I just gave you the tools, the courage, the strength, the determination. All that came from you." And maybe he was right. Maybe Margaret had always had that strength inside her, just waiting for the right time to appear. The total humiliation she'd suffered didn't destroy her. It transformed her, made her realize what she was capable of. The new Margaret was a different woman. She still had a kind heart, still cooked for the neighbors, still tended to the flowers with care. But now she had boundaries, knew how to say no, knew how to recognize when someone was trying to take advantage of her. She'd learned that kindness doesn't mean being a doormat, that self-love is as important as love for others. She looked back at the months in the trailer park, at the suffering she went through, and didn't regret anything. Because all that brought her here, back to the house she loved, surrounded by people who really cared, living with dignity and peace. Wounded, yes. Some scars never completely disappear, but whole again, complete, free. And that freedom was priceless. Margaret's story teaches us that it's never too late to fight for what's ours, for our dignity, for our justice. She could have given up, accepted defeat, lived the rest of her life in that trailer carrying the pain of betrayal. But she chose to fight, chose to believe she deserved more, and that choice changed everything. Sometimes the biggest betrayals come from those we love most, but the strength to overcome can also come from unexpected places, from neighbors who became family, from strangers who became angels, from within ourselves when we think we have nothing left. Margaret recovered her house, her dignity, her life. But more than that, she recovered herself. And you? Have you been through something similar? Have you been betrayed by someone in your family? Have you felt like you lost everything and needed to start from scratch? How would you react if you were in Margaret's place? Tell us here in the comments. Your story can inspire and help other people who are going through similar situations. We learn a lot when we share our experiences. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss other emotional stories that bring life lessons and make us reflect on our own choices and relationships. Each story here is a reminder that no matter how difficult it is, there's always hope. There's always a way to start over, and you're never alone in this journey.